In building material brands, we're working with a lot of audiences, a lot of different buyers, a big buying committee, and often more convoluted and more complex than we would like. And along the way, we've been making some assumptions about where our audiences are looking, what they care about, and how they're getting our information. And I think it's time that we take a reset and really dig into these audiences to understand how can we make an impact and do better as brands. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Let's
let's
dig in. Welcome to Constructive Insights. Today, we're here to talk about something that I think every building materials brand should really be thinking about, and that is how our buyers are changing. And when I think about that, it's not really only about the products that they're purchasing, but what's influencing their behavior. Where are they searching for information? What pressure are they under? And what is really coming to mind when they're in this product search? And so I'm really excited today to be joined by our media strategy director, Terri Cameron, who's going to dig into this with me. And because I really think that this is about the intersection of media and communications, thinking about, how do we connect with them and how do we get their attention, but also in the ways that matter when it comes to what they're thinking about and what they need and the information that's going to make the biggest impact. So thanks for joining me.
thanks, Jen. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And what I think is really interesting about what's happening is that the behavior shift that we're seeing is just important as the market shift that's happening. We know that you know homeowners, architects, contractors, dealers, they're doing things so differently now. They are researching differently. They're validating their choices more thoroughly. And they're looking for new types of information that they weren't even looking for even a few years ago. So I'm super excited to talk about this with you.
Excellent. So, what we're going to do together today is really dig into core of the key buyers. So, we're going to look at our homeowners, our contractors, our dealers, our distributors, and our architects. And for each of these audiences, we're really going to get into the mindset. We're going to see, what pressures they're up against, what's influencing their decisions, where they're going for information, where they're doing that research, and what brand should really be doing in this space to win with these audiences today. So, with that, let's dig into the first one. Okay, so we're going to start with homeowners. And really, I think this is the audience that's changed most emotionally. When you think about homeowners and the work that we do with them, we're really seeing a lot of anxiety in this space. They're looking for products with durability, they're looking for that long term, and they're scared to make the wrong decision. And especially, with money being tight right now, with budgets not what they used to be, a lot of homeowners are really digging in deeper because they're afraid to make the wrong decision.
Exactly, and you really see that kind of that tension and that anxiety in the behavior that they're having. They're now a very heavily researching type of audience. They're spending a ton of time validating their choices and their decisions before they actually go ahead and make that purchase. So they're spending time on YouTube watching reviews. They're going into Reddit threads, seeing what other people are saying. They're looking at contractor reviews and getting kind of that expertise opinion, and they just want to make sure that they consume lots of reviews and content, but also like mistakes others have made and things to watch out for. They're getting all of this information before they make that ultimate decision to buy.
That's absolutely right. And for me, from a messaging perspective, I find that really interesting because we can no longer focus on, inspiration or aspiration alone. We can't just show the pretty pictures of the finished projects or finished homes. We have to actually talk about those proof points and that durability and that long-term sustainability that people are looking for.
Exactly. And when we think about things like tariffs, it's really kind of amplifying that pressure. We know that right now, about 60% of homeowners are saying that they can no longer, really afford the renovations that they had planned. So, cost sensitivity isn't something that just applies to some people anymore. It's an actual real problem, and it's changing buyer behavior.
And I would say, especially in younger homeowners, I recently read a study where it was saying exactly that. Homeowners want that durability. They want to know that the products that they choose are going to last long, be on their house, protect what matters most. But the younger homeowners, especially, are really stretched when it comes to that affordability. And that's really what matters most to them, which I know from our conversation, we're really seeing that activity and that behavior when they're looking for information. They're craving this type of information.
And absolutely. And that's why, behavior on platforms really makes a difference here. We know that when, homeowners are looking for discovery and education, that's when they're going to, TikTok and Instagram. And when they're looking for, inspiration and ideas, they're on House and Pinterest. But what's important is that, they are seeking validation. And that's really critically important to homeowners now. And that's when they're going to YouTube and Reddit and ensuring that, they're really digging in and doing that research. And that's an important distinction that I think a lot of mentions.
So then, of course, we can't forget about AI because an AI is completely changing the journey. And I mean from start to finish, right? So for homeowners, we're seeing a lot more activity, obviously, when it comes to Gemini, ChatGPT, all of the LLM platforms that they're using alongside Google to do their research. And they're starting at the beginning. They're asking, how can I make my deck look better? And they're using it all the way through all the way to comparing prices of products, comparing reviews from products, and making their decision ultimately with their AI buddy by their side.
Because if homeowners are asking AI for, recommendations or comparisons or project, guidelines, brands have to be there and be ready with content that's actually like specific and useful and easy to understand and not just, things that polished to look good.
Which also is very hard for brands, right? Because we want everything to look good and everything to look polished. But we also, there's a level of transparency now that our audience expects, right? They want us to talk about costs. They never, brands don't like talking about costs. We know that. But that's what these models are pulling from, right? So we need to be more transparent about performing proof points, as we've talked about lots, but also cost, delivery times, all of that nitty gritty that we know people are asking for. And if we're not serving up the information, somebody will.
So when we think about the types of content that are really resonating with homeowners now, it's things like, real world examples, comparative content, before and afters, and frankly, brands being candid about maybe times when they might not be the best choice and just being authentic that way. Because, brands and marketers, they need to understand how complex the buyer journey is for homeowners right now. And there's a lot more need for a variety of content and authentic content than ever before.
So if I were to take the homeowner overall, I think for brands today, it really boils down to reducing that anxiety, looking at that financial, that emotional stress, and really helping to be that partner and provide that confidence that they're craving.
Okay, so let's switch it up and talk about contractors. This audience is in a completely different mindset right now. They are deeply operational and their world is all about like executional pressures, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes to our contractors, the things that are top of mind and kind of the question that they're asking every day is, can I keep this on schedule? Will my products deliver on time? Can I keep the promises I made? Do I have the resources to get it done? Will this land in budget? These are all the practical challenges and struggles that they have each and every day.
Exactly. And you can really see that in even like what they're searching for. They're online looking for things like estimating tools and, ways of coordinating their subcontractors, things like permits and spec requirements, very technical data, and even like construction management workflows. So, even the activity and the behavior that they have online in terms of what they're searching, it's incredibly practical.
Which is also really interesting because, of course, that makes a lot of sense. This is their job, this is their role. They are execution and operational, but also they're dealing with a lot of pressure right now when it comes to labor shortages, right? So they're being asked to do more with less. They have less resources, and yet they have tighter timelines, tighter budgets. How are they turning all of this around? And so they're looking for solutions literally in the day to day that's going to help them and their business survive. And so when it comes to innovation and product innovation, manufacturer innovation, if it's not solving those immediate problems, it's not going to succeed in the eyes of our characters.
Exactly, and that makes us think about AI because we know that contractors are interested in AI and not because it's, future thinking, whatever. They see an opportunity for it to help them practically in their real life. So they're, tapping into AI for things like how can it save them time? How can it, reduce some of those administrative tasks? How can it help them kind of coordinate things a little bit better and just frankly, maybe help offset in terms of the administration type stuff, offset some of those labor shortages that are kind of plaguing the industry right now.
Which is a great point because then we speak about messaging, right? So if this is what they're looking for, then things like beautiful projects and, long-term durability, they do meaning to stand up, but that's more of a homeowner play. They're looking for things like reduced callbacks, faster installation, time savings. All of those types of messages are what are landing right now versus the more inspirational approaches.
And Jen, one thing we know about this audience is that they are, highly influenced by peers. They are, going onto YouTube, looking at walkthroughs. They're looking at field tested demonstrations. They want to, tap into their supplier relationships for recommendations. We know that, even publishers and industry news, there's lots of great trade publishers out there for this audience with like King Contractor and the ATC's Constructor publication, lots of industry insights that they trust very well, and just basically just their peers, contractor forums, places through the AGC or Reddit or what have you, where they really tap into individuals who understand their challenges, and they really trust the feedback that they get from those places.
Now, yes, but also let's be clear, this is not a browsing audience, right? They're not just kind of spending time during their workday scrolling forums just for the fun of it. They're looking at these platforms and these resources because they have a problem to solve, because they're looking for a product, because they're looking for something specifically. And so when brands want to meet them, they need to meet them where they are with their challenges that they're actually digging into. And I think what's also important is, I mentioned they're not scrolling during the day. That's because they're often also doing this research at night. Their days are chock full of operational needs. And so at night, they are digging in to do this research and to really find the solutions for the problems they have.
So what marketers really need to understand about contractors is that, the influence that is happening isn't just in those traditional advertising channels anymore. So the brands that are going to be successful with contractors moving forward are the ones that are, just helping them reduce, the headaches and reduce anxiety and helping them just perform in their jobs better.
So, looking across our audiences, I would say that our dealers are actually experiencing the most structural pressure right now. They're experiencing the tariffs, the compression to margins, all of the supply issues. They're also sitting in the intersection. They're really sitting in the middle of the ecosystem, dealing with all of the changes that are happening with manufacturers and supply issues and timing issues, and then also the changing behavior of their customers and how they want to be served and how they want to get their products. And it's really becoming, a very challenging place to be.
And there's a really kind of interesting contradiction happening right now because if you talk to dealers and distributors, they'll say that this is still a very much a relationship driven business, which it is to an extent. But if we also think about the changing behavior of buyers and of builders and contractors, they are much more frequently online. They're doing their own research and their own comparisons. In many cases, they want, kind of faster and self-serve buying options. So that traditional kind of rep-driven selling and relationship business is really kind of being flipped on its head.
Exactly. And so that means that dealers and distributors are really having to rethink where their value comes from. Because we see that digital behavior changing and we're seeing far more expectations and higher expectations when it comes to, you mentioned self-serve, but that online ordering ability, being able to have those portals, having that seamless fulfillment, having very fast pricing, right? Immediate pricing available, even better mobile access, all of these demands that suit the day-to-day needs of our buyers from the dealers and distributors.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to think about, how the remodeling market is affecting this because we know that remodeling now accounts for a lot more of the market than it used to. And that shift, that's really changing how dealers are going to be operating.
That's a great point because what that means is more frequent purchases, fast and turnarounds, and homeowners that are actually influencing the decision more than ever. So it's kind of more of that flow through. But again, it is impacting how dealers and distributors are selling and what they need in order to satisfy it.
Exactly. And behaviorally, we see, dealers and distributors becoming much more operationally focused. They're looking for content about, pricing forecasts and, the volatility in the supply chain. And obviously making sure that they are putting a lot of focus on e-commerce enablement. So this audience right now is very focused on, both resilience and just being competitive in the marketplace.
And I think that's actually where a lot of manufacturers miss the mark. This is where they kind of misunderstand the relationship and the value that they can provide their dealers and distributors. Because this audience doesn't want more products to sell. They don't just want, yes, they want you to promote the products and they want you to do a good job at that. But they also want selling support. And so they want to be able to, bring up your brand and a customer recognize it. So they want you to be doing the support to build that brand and build that recognition. They want your help when it comes to what are those key selling features? How can we convince customers? What are the benefits? How can you help my team kind of level up when it comes to that sales support element? They want those quick resources. They want to be able to turn around that sale as we were talking about much more quickly because that's what the audience demands. And so manufacturers that are able to step into that and be more of that partner in that process and kind of team together and provide those resources are really, becoming indispensable for these dealers and distributors today.
This audience is almost looking for partners that will kind of help share the load. I mean, building awareness and getting your name out there to some of those, those awesome publishers that we know go into this space like HBS Dealer and LBM Journal and Hardlines, all great partners for building awareness. But what we know is that what this audience really, really needs is better support. They need things like marketing insights and to build home marketing programs together and other like just practical resources that help them, sell more effectively.
And so what I think you're saying too is that the see a lot of brands just talking about themselves, right? When the questions that our dealers and distributors are asking is how does this help me compete? How can this help my business? And how can this help me retain customers? Those types of questions are what our brands and manufacturers really should be helping to answer for them in today's industry.
All right, next, let's dig into architects. And this is really interesting because that's probably the role that we've seen the most change in professionally. It's really a role that is evolving and changing very rapidly, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because architects have always been that marriage of kind of bringing that creative vision and that, viability what in actually building it. And so that hasn't changed. That is still very important. That is still very much their role. What has kind of shifted or evolved or kind of become more visible is the emphasis on that execution element. And so what I mean by that is, with more design built out there, with tighter timelines, no A and B, labor shortages, and sustainability demands, they're being asked to really put emphasis on all of this earlier in the process to really think about execution right from the start. And so with that, I think it's also important for us to dig into sustainability when it comes to our bands, because what used to be kind of the big concept now must be measurable, right? So they're needing to prove every decision they make. They need to make sure that they have the numbers, the testing, everything to meet the requirements, the codes, the standards, that they're able to say, what's the product made of? What's its carbon impact? What's going to be the results over time? Um, to be able to show that they have this thinking and this proven way of approaching this building in place. And so because of that, manufacturers can no longer kind of float on those generic claims. They need to have, the testing done. They need to have those numbers in place, and they need to be able to prove what they're saying with factual evidence to support what architects are doing.
And you can really see that in how they're gathering information. Obviously, inspiration still plays a really big role early in the process, but the deeper research is becoming more and more technical and more practical. They're online digging for things like bid ready resources and technical documentation, sustainability data, like you mentioned, and even real world examples and anything that will help them effectively move from concept, which is important to them, into execution, which is becoming much more.
And what's interesting is a lot of brands gatekeep that information. And I think that that's actually a miss,
Yeah.
right? These architects, they want to find that information. If you want to get specced, you have to have that information available. And being able to open that up and really be transparent, I think is where a lot more brands are or would be able to wing the architects today. Absolutely.
And when we think about where this audience is kind of finding their information, we know that, they're still looking for inspiration and such on, publisher sites like, Arc Daily and Canadian Architect and social places like Interest in Instagram and what have you. But when it comes to, moving forward into specification and execution, that's when that behavior becomes much more like technical and validation driven. So this is when the architecture audience kind of shifts toward seeking out, supplier support, and they look at forums and, peer reviewed channels. They, go to Reddit. They look for structured kind of learning environments where they can watch webinars or consume, technical courses or get, maybe education credits, which is part of their role. So that shift really happens towards the end as they're kind of like validating their choices.
And if I would say, I think that that's where some brands are kind of missing the ball, right? That's where they're still leading into that creativity, that design element, that aesthetic element. And of course, that's still very important, but it's really being able to then take them down that layered journey of proving performance that's extremely important for our architectural audience. And to add to that, our architects are creatures of habit, right? So if they've used something in the past and they know it's worked and they know it's performed the way that it should, they will go back to that. It not only saves them time, but it gives them the confidence. And so there is an element of loyalty that we need to be considering with architects when it comes to their usage and specing of products in this space.
Which means that marketing to architects today is, a little bit less about, selling that vision, and it's more about just helping them get it right, because the easier that we make it for architects to, specify and defend your product, the, more valuable ultimately your brand will become.
When you step back and look at all of these audiences together, I think the common thread is really pressure, right? They're all trying to reduce risk in some way. Our homeowners want more confidence. Our contractors want more predictability. Our dealers and distributors want more stability. And our architects want more of that kind of execution clarity. And so the marketers that are able to support and become more useful partners are really the ones that are going to get more noticed and selected in the space.
Exactly. And what we see across the board similarly is that behavior is changing because of all these pressures. We know that people are, researching more deeply. They're validating through their peers across, all of the audiences that we've talked about. They're moving between platforms, using them in different ways for inspiration and research and such. We know that AI is influencing their decisions in a big way, and that we need to be creating content that AI will recognize. And influence now is just kind of, as a result, influence is fragmented more than ever.
Right. And so I think doing the work that we did today and really digging in and listening to what the audiences need is really what's going to set the brands apart and being able to deliver and become that an indispensable partner as we talked about. And so with that, thanks for listening.